I know what you're thinking. That I'm too big, too strong. Not like the other women, but I'm fertile. I can give you sons, strong sons, to carry your name. Just let me live. Her voice was raw, a prayer torn from the dust. She was on her knees, this giant of a woman, trembling under a sun that offered no mercy. Her name was Ara, though I didn't know it then. To me, she was just a desperate soul in the crosshairs of my Winchester. My finger rested on the trigger. It had been 3 years since I'd felt anything but the cold weight of silence. The silence of a cabin without laughter. The silence of a crib gathering dust. The silence of 2 graves on a lonely hill. I'd prayed to God to break that silence. Heaven never answered. Now, this woman knelt before me, magnificent and terrifying, broken and strong, offering the one thing I thought I'd buried forever, a family. Her eyes met mine. They weren't afraid of death. They were afraid of being sent back. Behind me, the earth began to tremble, a dust cloud on the horizon. Not a storm, riders, and they were coming fast. My gut twisted. She wasn't just lost. She was hunted. "Shoot me if you must," she whispered, her voice unbent. "But don't send me back." The thunder of hooves grew louder, rattling my bones. I had seconds. I remembered the fever that stole my wife, my child. I remembered the silence that followed, a living thing with fangs. Was this an answer? Or a test? I lowered the rifle. I tossed her my canteen. "Drink," I rasped. "Then get up. You're coming with me." Relief flashed in her eyes, but something fiercer burned behind it, a promise of a war she was not done fighting. She followed me to the cabin, her wounded leg leaving a smear of blood in the dry grass. I didn't know it then, but 3 years of silence had just ended, and in its place, a storm was being born, one that would either save me or tear my world apart. I slammed the heavy barn door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dust cloud was closer now, resolving into 3 distinct figures, 3 riders moving with the kind of purpose that meant trouble. My mind screamed at me to turn her out, to cut her loose before they reached my land. But when I looked at her, standing tall despite the gash in her leg, her jaw set with a fire that was equal parts fear and defiance, I knew it was too late. I was already in it. "Inside," I muttered, gesturing toward the cabin. She shook her head, her braids swaying. "If they find me hiding, they'll burn this place down, and kill you for it." Her words hit me like a cold slap. She was right. I knew the kind of men who rode like that. They didn't leave witnesses. The riders pulled up at my gate, their horses snorting, leather creaking in the dying sun. The leader, a man with a wicked scar that split his cheek, spat in the dirt. "Evening, Stone," he drawled, his eyes cold and empty. "Heard you found some company. Big company." His gaze cut to Ara, who stood in plain sight beside the barn. "That one belongs to us." I tightened my grip on the Winchester. Every instinct told me to lie, to deny everything. But Ara didn't flinch. She stood straighter, her shoulders squared, daring them to try, daring me to betray her. "She stays," I said. My voice sounded like rocks grinding together. The scarred man smirked. "Didn't figure you for a fool, Stone. Word is you lost your family to the fever. A real shame. Could have kept to your grief. Now you're about to lose everything else." His men let out a mean, sharp laugh. One of them cocked his revolver, the sound snapping through the tense air. Ara's hand dropped to a crude knife strapped to her thigh, her whole body coiling like a predator ready to spring. I stepped forward, raising my rifle until the barrel was level with the scarred man's chest. "You set 1 foot past that gate," I said, my voice low and steady, "and none of you ride away from here." The world held its breath. The horses stamped, the dust swirled, sweat trickled down my temple. The scarred man's smirk never wavered, but something in his eyes flickered. He spit again, his grin splitting his face like a fresh wound. We'll be back, Stone, he promised. And when we do, you'll wish you'd died with your wife. He yanked the reins, wheeling his horse around. The others followed, thundering back into the horizon, leaving a trail of dust and threats hanging in the air. I only lowered my rifle when they were gone. My shoulders ached with a tension I hadn't felt in years. Ara finally exhaled, her chest heaving. They won't stop, she said quietly. I nodded, my jaw tight. Then neither will we. The rest of the day was a blur of hard, desperate work. I boarded up the windows, my arms screaming with the effort. I stacked sandbags against the porch, creating a makeshift barricade. Ara, limping but relentless, dragged bales of straw away from the cabin, creating a firebreak. Her hands, I noticed, were already blistered and raw, but she never stopped. Every time I looked at her, I saw a history written in scars, a story of battles she had somehow survived. By dusk, my ranch looked less like a home and more like a fortress. We sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on our faces. She sharpened her knife with slow, steady strokes. I cleaned my rifle, the familiar ritual calming my frayed nerves. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken questions. "You've been running a long time," I finally said. Her dark eyes met mine. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "Too long." The words carried the weight of 1,000 miles, of countless nights spent looking over her shoulder. I wanted to ask more, but I held my tongue. I knew better than anyone that some wounds are too raw to touch. When I finally laid down to sleep, my rifle within arm's reach, the silence of the prairie felt different. It was heavier, charged with anticipation, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't alone in it. I wasn't sure if that made me safer or if I had just invited the devil to my door. Dawn broke red, bleeding across the horizon like a fresh wound. I rose with it, my body sore, my mind sharp. Ara was already outside, hauling water from the well, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes burning with that same untamed fire. I had the urge to tell her to leave, to disappear before the riders came back. But one look at her set jaw and I knew she wouldn't run. And a part of me, a part I thought had died long ago, didn't want her to. Then the sound came, a low, distant rumble. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate. Hooves, not 3 this time. More, so many more. The horizon was turning red with dust. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest, and stepped onto the porch. Ara was there in an instant, her knife in hand, standing tall even as fresh blood seeped through the bandage on her leg. Together, we watched the storm of riders approach, their shadows swelling as they drew closer. The scarred man was with them, but this time, he wasn't leading. He rode beside a man on a fine black horse, a man who sat tall and wore clothes too clean for this part of the country. This new man radiated an aura of cold, calculating power. This wasn't a posse, this was an army. Ara's voice was steady beside me, a strange calm in the face of the coming onslaught. "If this is the end," she said, not looking at me, "then we end it fighting." My jaw clenched. I raised the rifle, the rising sun glinting off the steel. "Together," I said, and as the thunder of hooves swallowed the world, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not despair. It was life, raw and fierce, surging through my veins. A life worth fighting for. The sun beat down, merciless. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of impending violence. 5 riders broke from the main group, thundering toward the gate. The scarred man was one of them. The others were hard-faced men I'd never seen before, their guns already drawn. "One last chance, Stone!" the scarred man yelled, his voice carrying over the rumble. "Give us the woman, and the boss might let you live." The boss. So the man on the black horse was in charge. He watched from a distance, impassive, as if this were a business transaction. Ara stepped forward, her bare feet planting in the dirt. Her voice was low, but it carried like a war drum. "I am no one's property to be given." The men laughed, a hungry, ugly sound. The scarred man's grin was a knife slash. "Then we'll take you from his corpse." I didn't wait for another word. I fired. The Winchester bucked against my shoulder, the shot splitting the air. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from the scarred man's horse. The animal screamed and reared, nearly unseating him. Chaos erupted. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering the fence posts around me. I dropped behind the sandbags, returning fire with grim precision. The world narrowed to the kick of my rifle, the smell of gunpowder, the sharp whine of lead cutting past my head. Beside me, Ara was a blur of motion. She darted toward the stable, bullets chewing up the ground at her heels, and emerged with a spear she'd fashioned from a sharpened fence post. She planted herself in the open yard, a warrior queen daring them to approach. One rider, bolder than the rest, spurred his horse forward, revolver blazing. Ara moved like lightning. With a guttural cry, she hurled the spear. It flew true, striking the man in the shoulder and ripping him from the saddle. He hit the dust with a scream, his horse bolting into the prairie. The other riders cursed, their shots growing wilder. Ara was already moving, yanking her spear free, her arms slick with blood. She looked like something from a legend, half woman, half storm. I fired again, sending another rider's hat flying, the bullet grazing his scalp. He yelped and wheeled his horse away, retreating in a panic. The scarred man roared in fury and charged, rifle leveled at me. I ducked as a bullet screamed past my ear, shattering the porch rail. I rolled and came up firing, my shot tearing a chunk from his thigh. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. He aimed again, his face a mask of hate. Then Ara was there. She lunged from the side, her massive frame slamming into the horse's flank. The animal shrieked and went down, throwing the scarred man to the ground. His rifle flew from his grasp. Ara stood over him, her spear raised high, her shadow swallowing him whole. Her chest heaved, her face a mask of pure, undiluted rage. For the first time, the scarred man looked afraid. Truly afraid. "Do it!" I shouted, my voice raw. "End it!" But she froze. The tip of the spear trembled inches from his throat. Her breath came in ragged gasps. I could see the killer in her eyes, the survivor who had done what was necessary. But I could also see something else, something fighting against it. A conflict that was tearing her apart. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the spear. The scarred man scrambled backward, clutching his wounded leg, and crawled toward his horse. His remaining men swooped in, dragging him into the saddle before retreating in a cloud of dust and curses. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the man Ara had speared. He lay sprawled in the yard, clutching his shoulder. I staggered forward, my rifle hot, and leveled it at him. "No!" Ara's voice was sharp. She stepped between me and the wounded man. "He'll just bring them back," I growled. "Let him!" she snapped, her eyes blazing. "Killing a wounded man won't stop what's coming. It will only make us like them." My finger hovered on the trigger. I saw the logic in her words, but the rage in my heart screamed for vengeance. For 3 years, I had been a ghost. Now, I was alive with it. But looking into her eyes, I saw a strength I couldn't deny. I lowered the rifle. The wounded man stared at us, his eyes wide with terror, before scrambling to his feet and stumbling away after his comrades. Ara turned to me, her gaze intense. There was fire in her eyes and sorrow and something else I couldn't name. "You risked everything for me," she whispered. I swallowed, my throat tight. Maybe I was tired of having nothing to risk. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant rain. The sky began to darken. The man on the black horse, the boss, had watched the entire exchange without moving a muscle. Now he slowly turned his horse and rode away, his army following in silent, disciplined ranks. It wasn't a retreat. It felt like a strategic withdrawal. Ara lowered her spear, her body trembling as the adrenaline faded. We only bought ourselves a little time. She was right. I knew it in my bones. They would be back. Not with 5 men, but with all of them. And they wouldn't stop until the ground was salted with our blood. Looking at the approaching storm clouds, I felt the first spark of something I thought long dead. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was the grim resolve of a man who had finally found something to die for. The storm broke with a fury that matched the battle. Rain lashed down, turning the yard into a sea of mud. Lightning tore the sky apart, followed by thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations. I stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the world drown. Ara stood beside me, a silent sentinel, the rain plastering her braids to her back. Then we heard it, a sound that had no place in a storm. The rhythmic, sucking sound of hooves in deep mud. A lot of them. They were back. They had used the cover of the storm to approach. Lanterns appeared through the deluge, bobbing like malevolent ghosts. It was the boss on his black horse, and with him, at least a dozen riders. The scarred man was there too, his leg bandaged, his face twisted with hate. "You had your chance, Stone!" he screamed over the wind and rain. "Tonight, your ranch burns, and the woman is ours!" A ragged cheer went up from the men. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the 2 graves on the hill, barely visible through the sheeting rain. I had begged for an answer, and maybe this was it. Not peace, but a war. The first shot cracked through the storm, splintering the wood next to my head. I dropped, returning fire, the Winchester kicking hard. A rider screamed and tumbled into the mud. The world dissolved into a chaos of churning mud, flashing guns, and the roar of the storm. Ara was a whirlwind of violence. She hurled her spear, impaling a rider who got too close. His lantern shattered, flames hissing out in the rain. She met another who charged the porch on foot, slamming into him with the force of a battering ram. They went down in the mud, and she came up with his revolver, her fist cracking against his jaw with a sound like breaking wood. But there were too many. For every one we took down, 2 more pressed forward. The air was a hornet's nest of bullets. "They're going for the barn!" Ara shouted, her voice raw. I saw them. 2 riders, breaking off, lanterns held high. If they lit the hay, we were finished. I cursed and sprinted across the yard, mud sucking at my boots. A bullet tore past my ear, so close I felt its heat. I dove into the barn just as a lantern shattered against the doorframe, flames roaring to life in the dry straw. I grabbed a pitchfork, ramming it into the chest of a raider scrambling inside. He went down with a gurgle. I kicked at the flames, stomping them out, my lungs filling with acrid smoke. A figure filled the doorway. It was the man on the black horse, the boss. He held a pistol, its aim steady. His clothes were still impeccably clean. "You've been a nuisance, Mr. Stone," he said, his voice calm and cultured. It was more chilling than any scream. But all things must end. My rifle was outside, my chest heaved. I grabbed a rusty hammer from a workbench, the only weapon I could find. He smiled, a cold, predatory thing, and raised his pistol. A roar that was not thunder split the air. Ara crashed through the doorway like an avenging angel. She didn't have her spear. She had a heavy cart axle, ripped from its wheels, and she swung it like a club. The boss's eyes widened in shock a split second before the axle connected with his side, sending him flying into a pile of hay, his pistol discharging into the rafters. Ara stood over him, the axle held high, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. Rain and sweat streamed down her face. "You will not take me," she hissed, the words a promise and a curse. "You will not take anyone else." The boss stared up at her, his calm demeanor shattered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief and fear. His hand scrabbled for his dropped pistol. I was faster. I kicked it away, sending it skittering into the darkness. For a heartbeat, The barn was silent, but for the hammering rain. Ara's hands trembled on the heavy axle. She could end it all. One blow. "Do it," I rasped, my own voice shaking. But again she froze. A pained, guttural sound escaped her lips. "No," she whispered, the word aimed at herself more than us. "I will not become the monster they tried to make." She let the axle fall to the ground with a heavy thud. The boss's men, seeing their leader defeated, began to falter. The scarred man tried to rally them, but their will was broken. They dragged their boss onto a horse and melted back into the storm, a defeated rabble. Silence returned. The rain still fell, but the gunfire was gone. Ara swayed on her feet, the strength finally leaving her. I caught her, my hand on her arm. Her skin was fever hot. "It's over," I said softly. "We're safe." Her dark eyes met mine. In them, I saw a history of pain so deep I could barely comprehend it. But beneath it, for the first time, was a glimmer of something else, something fragile and new. Hope. "You have a name," I said. It wasn't a question. "Ara," she whispered. "Marcus," I replied. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, a different kind of quiet settled. Not the silence of loss, but the silence of two people breathing in the same small space, alive against all odds. For the first time since I'd dug 2 graves on a hill, I didn't feel alone. And for the first time in a lifetime of running, Ara looked like she might have found a place to stop. The rain washed the blood from the dirt, but it couldn't wash away the questions. When the dawn came, gray and weary, we stood in the wreckage of the battle. The boss was gone, his army scattered, but I knew men like that didn't just give up. This wasn't over. It was just a pause. "Who is he?" I asked, looking out at the battered fence line. Ara was quiet for a long time. "His name is Corbin Vance," she said finally, her voice flat. "He buys up land. He buys up people. He thinks he can own the whole world." "And you?" I asked. "What does he want with you?" She finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a pain that went deeper than any wound. "My family. We're not like other people, Marcus. We're bigger, stronger. For generations we guarded something. A valley hidden in the mountains. A place untouched by men like Vance." She took a ragged breath. "He wanted it. He couldn't find it, so he decided to buy the key. He arranged a marriage. With me." It all clicked into place. The giant bride. The desperate flight. The scarred man. I started. "Silas," she whispered, the name like poison on her tongue. "My brother. He made a deal with Vance, the valley. In exchange for power, wealth. He helped Vance capture my family. I was the only one who got away." A cold fury settled in my gut. This was bigger than my ranch, bigger than one woman's freedom. "He won't stop until he has the valley," she said, "and he won't stop until I'm either dead or back in his cage." A name had been nagging at me, a detail I couldn't place. Corbin Vance. I'd heard it before. Then it hit me, a punch to the gut. I stumbled into the cabin, rummaging through an old wooden chest until I found it. A deed. The original deed to my land, from before I'd had to sell off the upper pastures. The signatory for the land company, Corbin Vance. "The fever that took my wife and son," I said, my voice hollow. "It wasn't random. It swept through this whole area. People got sick, sold their land for pennies on the dollar just to get away. All of it bought up by his company." Ara stared at me, her eyes widening in horror as she understood. "He didn't just try to buy your land, Marcus. He created the tragedy that forced you to sell." The silence in my cabin was no longer a ghost of grief. It was a monument to a crime. My personal hell hadn't been an act of God. It had been a business strategy. The rage that filled me was cold, pure, and absolute. It burned away the last 3 years of sorrow, leaving behind something hard and sharp as steel. "He took my family," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. He tried to take you. This doesn't end with him running. It ends with him in the ground." Ara looked at the determination on my face, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't look like a hunted animal. She looked like a soldier ready to follow a general into hell. "What do we do?" she asked. "We stop defending," I said, picking up my Winchester. "We start hunting." Our first move was to the nearby town of Redemption, a dusty collection of buildings that Vance practically owned. We rode in at dusk, keeping to the shadows. It was a long shot, but I remembered the town doctor, a good man named Elias, who had fought desperately to save my wife. He had always been suspicious about the fever. We found him in his small office, smelling of antiseptic and whiskey. He was older now, his face etched with the memory of too many lost patients. When I told him my suspicion, that the fever was no fever at all, but poison, I saw a flicker of grim validation in his eyes. "I knew it," he whispered, his hands shaking. "The symptoms were wrong. I sent samples to a lab in the city. The results never came back. My office was broken into a week later. All my notes were gone." He looked at us, his eyes burning. "Vance runs this town. The sheriff, the mayor, they're all on his payroll. You can't fight him here." "We don't need to fight him here," Ara said, her voice low and firm. "We just need proof." Elias looked at Ara, at her size and the raw power she radiated. Then he looked at me, at the new cold fire in my eyes. He made a decision. "Vance keeps meticulous records. He's arrogant. He believes he's untouchable. He has a ledger, a private one, in the safe in his office at the land company." The land company building was the largest in town, a 2-story false front that loomed over the dusty main street. Getting in would be suicide. But Elias had a plan. Every week, a wagon delivered supplies from the city. The driver was a man who owed Elias his life. The next night, Ara and I were hidden under a canvas tarp in the back of that wagon. We were smuggled into the warehouse behind the land office. The air was thick with the smell of paper and ink. From there, it was a tense crawl through darkened hallways, every creak of the floorboards, a thunderclap in the silence. Vance's office was opulent, a shrine to his own greed. A massive oak desk, leather chairs, and on the wall, a map of the territory with huge swathes of it marked in his name, including my land, and a large, unmarked area in the mountains, Ara's Valley. The safe was behind a painting. It was old, iron, and formidable. I was about to try and force it when Ara simply put her hands on the door, found a purchase, and pulled. The sound of groaning, shearing metal was terrifyingly loud. The hinges screamed and then snapped. She tore the door clean off. Inside, among stacks of cash and deeds, was a small, leather-bound ledger. We didn't have time to read it there. We took it and slipped back out into the night, our hearts pounding. We met Elias in a stable at the edge of town. By lantern light, we opened the book. It was all there. Page after page of cold, calculated evil. Records of payments for water contamination. Lists of families, mine included, marked as targets. Detailed plans for the acquisition of land. And the final prize, Project Eden, his plan to find and secure Ara's hidden valley. He hadn't just murdered my family. He had murdered dozens. "This is enough to hang him 10 times over," Elias breathed, his face pale. "Not if his sheriff is the one holding the rope," I said. "We can't win this with the law. We have to win it with blood." Before we left Redemption, there was one more stop to make. We went to the homes of 3 other ranchers whose names were in that ledger. Men who had lost wives, children, land. Hard men who had been broken by a grief they thought was fate. I showed them the ledger. I showed them the truth. I didn't ask them for help. I just showed them the face of the man who had destroyed their lives. When Ara and I rode out of Redemption that night, we were no longer just 2 people against an army. We were the beginning of a reckoning. We had the truth. We had allies. And we were riding back to my ranch to prepare for the final war. Corbin Vance had started a fire 3 years ago. We were about to use it to burn his entire world to the ground. The ride back to the ranch was different. The prairie wasn't a lonely, silent place anymore. It was the staging ground for a war. We knew Vance would discover the theft of his ledger soon. He would come, not with a small group of riders, but with everything he had. He would come to wipe us off the face of the earth. We had 2 days, maybe 3. The first rancher, a grim old man named Jebediah, who'd lost his 2 sons, arrived the next morning. He didn't say a word, just nodded at me and started checking the sight on his long-range buffalo rifle. By noon, the other 2 had arrived. Samuel, a young man whose wife had been taken by the fever, his eyes still haunted, and Hector, a Mexican rancher whose family had worked their land for 100 years before Vance had forced them out. They brought guns, ammunition, and a quiet, simmering rage that was more potent than any army. We were 5 against whatever Vance could throw at us. Ara was the heart of our defense. She saw the land not as a ranch, but as a battlefield. She directed us, her voice calm and clear, her strategic mind a thing of beauty. We dug trenches. We built barricades not just around the cabin, but in strategic positions across the property, using the rolling hills and rocky outcrops as natural cover. We set traps, covered pits, tripwires connected to alarms made of tin cans, deadfalls in the small patch of woods near the creek. Hector, who had fought bandits in his youth, showed us how to make crude explosives using blasting powder from my stores. We spent hours working, a silent, determined group of men and one giant woman, all bound by a shared desire for justice. During a break on the second day, as we watched the sun set, Samuel spoke for the first time. "I thought I was the only one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought God had abandoned me." "God has nothing to do with this," Jebediah grunted, not looking up from cleaning his rifle. "This is the work of men, and it will be ended by men." That night, a storm gathered on the horizon, mirroring the one brewing in our hearts. Ara and I stood on the porch, watching the lightning flash in the distant clouds. "Are you afraid?" I asked her. "I've been afraid my whole life," she replied softly. "Afraid of being caught, afraid of being alone, for the first time. I'm not afraid of the fight. I'm just afraid of losing what I've found here." She looked at me, and in the dim light, her eyes held a universe of emotion. I didn't know what to say. The words I felt were too new, too fragile to be spoken aloud. So instead, I just reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, strong and calloused, wrapped around mine. We stood there for a long time, 2 broken people who had found something whole in each other, waiting for the war to come to our doorstep. It came with the dawn. A scout we'd posted on the ridge came galloping back, his face pale. "They're coming!" he gasped. "Dozens of them!" We took our positions. I was with Jebediah on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main approach. Ara was with Samuel and Hector in a fortified trench near the barn. The air grew still. The birds fell silent. Then we saw them. A long line of riders, at least 30, cresting the far hill. Corbin Vance was at their head, on his fine black horse. Beside him rode Silas, Ara's brother, his face a mask of grim determination. They weren't a posse. They were a private army, armed to the teeth. They stopped just out of rifle range. Vance raised a pair of binoculars, surveying our defenses. A cruel smile spread across his face. He thought this would be easy. He thought he was crushing 5 insignificant gnats. Jebediah spat on the ground. "Let's show him what gnats can do." He settled behind his rifle, his breathing slow and even. The world seemed to hold its breath. The battle began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Jebediah's rifle sighed, and a half-mile away, one of Vance's lieutenants tumbled from his saddle. The shot was perfect. Vance's smile vanished. He barked an order, and his men charged, fanning out, their guns blazing. The world erupted in smoke and thunder. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around us. We returned fire, our shots measured and deliberate. Another rider went down, and another. But they kept coming, a relentless wave of violence. From the trench, I saw Ara rise up, a towering figure of defiance. She didn't have a gun. She had a heavy war hammer she'd forged from a sledgehammer and scrap metal. As the first riders reached the trench, she met them. The hammer swung in a brutal arc, crushing a man's chest, sending his horse screaming away. She was a force of nature, a one-woman shield wall, and Samuel and Hector fired from behind the cover she provided. One of Hector's explosives went off near the barn, sending a group of riders and their horses flying. The battle devolved into a brutal close-quarters slugfest. Men fell on both sides. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. I saw Silas break from the main group, leading a handful of men in a flanking maneuver toward the cabin, toward our last line of defense, and toward Ara. "Cover me!" I yelled to Jebediah. I broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt around my feet. I had to get to her. I had to stop him. I reached the trench just as Silas and his men did. He saw his sister, and a look of pure hatred twisted his features. "You should have stayed gone," he snarled, raising his revolver. Ara faced him, her war hammer held ready. "This is our home, Silas. You betrayed it. You betrayed our family." "I made us strong," he screamed. "Vance gave me power." "He gave you a leash," she shot back. Silas fired. I tackled Ara, pushing her down as the bullet whistled over our heads. We landed in the mud as his men swarmed the trench. I came up firing my revolver, taking down 2 of them before another slammed into me, his knife flashing. We rolled in the dirt, struggling for control. I saw Ara rise to her feet, her eyes locked on her brother. It was more than a fight. It was the tragic end of a family, playing out in blood and mud. She swung her hammer, not at him, but at the ground by his feet. The impact shook the earth, sending him stumbling backward. "I won't kill you, brother," she said, her voice shaking with grief and rage. "But I will not let you do this." He raised his gun to fire again, but Samuel, wounded but not out, shot it from his hand. Silas stared at his sister, his face a mess of confusion and defeat. His loyalty, his ambition, it all seemed to crumble in that moment, leaving behind a lost, broken man. Meanwhile, I finally got the upper hand, driving my elbow into my attacker's throat and sending him staggering back. I got to my feet just in time to see Corbin Vance, who had dismounted and made his way through the chaos, standing over Samuel, a pistol aimed at his head. "It's over, Stone," Vance said calmly, a predator who had cornered his prey. "Your little rebellion is finished." I raised my revolver. We were 20 feet apart, a standoff in the middle of a war. "You took my wife," I said, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would tear me in two. "You took my son." Vance actually laughed. "It was just business. Collateral damage." That's when I saw it. Hector, lying wounded nearby, slowly pushed a small bundle toward me with the last of his strength. Another one of his homemade bombs, a lit fuse sputtering. Vance's attention was on me. He didn't see it. I did the only thing I could. I fired, not at him, but at the ground just behind him. He flinched, startled, taking a step back. Right onto the bomb. The explosion was deafening. It threw me backward. When the smoke cleared, Corbin Vance was gone. Simply gone. The sight of their leader being vaporized broke the last of the attackers' will. They threw down their guns, surrendering or fleeing into the prairie. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the groans of the wounded. We had won. The aftermath was grim. We had lost Hector. Samuel was badly wounded, but Elias, who had ridden out at the first sound of gunfire, was already tending to him. Jebediah had survived without a scratch. Ara stood over her brother, who was now just sitting in the mud, weeping. She looked at me, her eyes asking a question. I nodded. She helped Silas to his feet and led him to a horse. Go, she told him, and never come back. Find a way to live with what you've done. He rode away, a defeated man disappearing over the horizon. We buried Hector on the hill, next to my wife and son. It felt right. They were all victims of the same man, now united in the same quiet earth. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the battered ranch, the four of us who remained stood together. My home was a wreck, littered with the scars of battle. But it was still standing. We were still standing. Ara came to me as I stood by the graves. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me, her massive frame surrounding me, and for the first time in 3 years, I let myself break. I leaned into her and wept. I wept for my wife, for my son, for Hector, for all the senseless loss. And she just held me, a silent, strong pillar in the ruins of my world. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something harder and truer. A future forged in mud and lightning, in grief and vengeance. We had faced the monster and won. Now came the hardest part, learning to live with the ghosts. We rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, we put the ranch back together. Jebediah and Samuel stayed, their own ranches feeling too empty to return to. We were a strange, broken family, bound by the blood we had shed together. Ara was the center of it all. She worked harder than any 3 men, her laughter slowly returning, chasing the shadows from the corners of the cabin. She taught me the songs of her people, stories of the hidden valley. I asked her once if she would ever go back. She looked at the graves on the hill, then at the new beams of the barn, then at me. My home is not a place on a map anymore, she said softly. It's a promise. We made it right here. One evening, months later, we sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the dusk. The silence was back, but it was a different kind now. It was peaceful, full of life. She turned to me, her eyes serious. I made you a promise once, she said, when I was on my knees in the dust, that I could give you sons. My heart ached with a bittersweet sorrow. Ara, let me finish, she said, her hand covering mine. I don't say it now as a bargain to save my life. I say it as a hope for a new life. With you. I looked at this incredible woman, this warrior, this survivor, this giant who had a heart bigger than the whole damn prairie. And I knew that the silence in my life had finally, truly been broken. Replaced not by the thunder of guns, but by the steady, hopeful beat of a second chance. This wasn't just a story about a fight for land. It was a story about a fight for a soul. My soul. And hers. It's a reminder that sometimes the family you choose is the one that bleeds with you. That home isn't just a place you inherit. It's a fortress you build with your own 2 hands, right on the ashes of what was meant to destroy you. If this story reached you, if you've ever felt like your world was burned to the ground only to find something beautiful growing in the ashes, then you're in the right place. There are more stories to tell, more battles to be won, and more dawns to meet. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. And drop a comment below. Tell us about a time you found strength when you thought all was lost. We read every single one,